What's up guys, welcome to a new video. In my last tutorial, I got this comment from Lily White asking if I could make a new video on how to make a Reese Bass. So that's exactly what we're gonna do today. Let's jump right into it. Alright, so the theory behind the Reese Bass sound is very simple. You basically just need to have two saw waves, one of them one octave lower than the other, and the upper one needs to have multiple voicings to make it wide. I'm going to show 4 different examples using 4 different synthesizers, and that way you can follow this tutorial in whatever program you're using. So the first plugin I'm going to start with is Serum. I'm going to use this one first because a lot of people have this plugin and it's very visual, so you can really see what's going on. Then I'm going to use some of the Ableton stock plugins. So if you don't have Serum, you can still learn how to do it. So this is what the initial preset sounds like. It's just a normal saw wave. To make the Reese Bass, first thing you can do is you can lower this octave. So now it's playing 1 octave lower, and you can add a second oscillator. So now you can hear 1 octave playing lower and the upper oscillator is playing the same note but an octave higher. For this second oscillator B, we're gonna increase the unison. So now you can hear the second oscillator is wide. I recommend wearing headphones for this so you can actually hear how it's on the sides. Next thing, very important if you're using Serum, it's to turn this random off. You want to make sure that the playback on this oscillator is starting always on the same point. Because if you have this random phase on, every single time you play a new note, it's gonna start from whatever position you're highlighting on this area. So sometimes it might start here, sometimes it might start here, sometimes it might start somewhere else. So especially with the bass, you want to make sure that every single time it's starting from the same place, so it's a consistent sound. Here you can change actually where it starts from. This one is just a range from where it can start from. I recommend leaving it at 180, but make sure both are set to 0 on the random. Now, very important, what makes this whole Reese Bass sound come to life is the filtering. I recommend using a MG Low 24 or 18. 1 octave lower. Next thing you want to do is make sure that each oscillator is starting on a different phase position. So for example, if we have the lower one at 180 degrees, we want to have the second one at 0 degrees. Because if we have both at the same one, there can be some phasing issues. That's a whole other topic that I could make a whole video on. Just let me know in the comments. So now we have this sound. Now it's very important that you adjust the ADSR controls. That's attack, decay, sustain, release. This depends on the genre, how you want the bass to sound like. But just to break it down simply, right now our bass, as soon as I let go of the key, it stops playing. If I have some release, you see how there's a tail to it. You can control how long this tail is. You can actually see it happening. If you lower the sustain, you're gonna have a much more of a plucky sound. But for the Reese Bass, we want it to be strong and consistent, so we're gonna keep the sustain all the way up. For the release, I would leave it around maybe 50, so it's not super sharp. Because if you leave it at 0, you're gonna hear some clicking. So at least somewhere between 20 and 50, it's good, but you don't want it to have too long, because you want to have full control over the sound. So next thing, very, very important, is to turn on the mono. Basically what this does is that it makes sure that only one note is playing at a time. Even though if you're pressing 2 different keys on the keyboard, it's gonna change between those keys as you press them. So if I have the mono off in Serum and I play an F and then I play an A, but if you turn it on, then as soon as the A starts playing, the F is going to stop. That's very, very important because especially at such low frequencies, you never want to have 2 notes playing at the same time. Maybe you want to have some glide between them, which is the next thing I'm going to show how to do. But very rarely you're going to want to have 2 notes playing at the same time, especially with the bass. If you check this portamento on and you increase this time, what that's going to make is that it's going to add a glide between the notes. Now you're gonna see when it goes from the F to an A, there's a glide. It's also very easy to see on the equalizer spectrum. You can see how the fundamental of the bass, which is this, glides up and down. If you want to add some punch to your Reese Bass, depending on what style of music you're making, you can do that with an envelope. So for example, with this envelope 2, we're gonna shape it like this, and then we're gonna drag this into our filter cutoff. So every time a new bass note plays, it's re-triggering this envelope. By pressing Alt or Option, you can adjust how much of this effect you want. Last thing, you can add some more unison to it. Now you can hear the phasing happening because there's so many different voices. It's like a flanger or a phase effect. In my opinion, this is a lot about experimentation, but I just want to show you guys the basics for it so you can experiment with it and come up with your own Reese basses. That's what I always like to do instead of just using a preset. So that was how to make a Reese bass in Serum. Now we're gonna apply the same principles and do it in Ableton stock plugin operator. First thing you want to do is you want to make sure you have 2 oscillators enabled. So let's just turn up the volume on oscillator B. I'm gonna put both of them at -12 dB and the master volume at -12. Now if we play as a note, you can hear it's a sine wave. So to change that, we're gonna go to the waves section here. We're gonna put saw digital, which is just a normal saw wave. And we're gonna do that for both oscillators. Now you can hear it sounds a bit different than the one in Serum, and that's because operator by default it's on FM synthesis mode. That's a whole other topic. If you want, I can make a video on it. To change this mode or algorithm, as Ableton calls it, you want to change this one into this one. Next thing you want to do is on one of the oscillators, you want to lower the chorus to 0.5. That's going to give you 1 octave lower. You can increase the spread to add some stereo width to it. Now the problem with operator is that this stereo width is being added to both oscillators. So to make the one with the octave lower mono, we're gonna use a utility effect and we're just gonna make bass mono. So now you can see, depending on which frequency I set this to on the utility, there's going to be more or less stereo width. I usually set this anywhere between 120 and 200 hertz. I'm gonna do 150. You can hear there's a bit of a punch to the sound. In my opinion, I don't want that. And that's because this second oscillator on the envelope mode, you see the ADSR was like this with some sustain. We want both of them to be like this so we have full control over them. Same thing with the release. Not too much. So the next thing is we want to make sure this is set to only one voice. If you want, you can turn off this filtering and use your own EQing to really dial in how much of the upper frequencies you want. Last thing we want to add here in the spread section, if you turn on the glide and you set it to about 200 milliseconds, we get a similar glide effect that we did in Serum. You could automate this to open up in a build-up, and then as soon as the drop comes in, it closes back down. So that's it in operator. Now we're gonna move to the analog. Okay, so the first thing we need to do to make the Reese bass in the analog synth is to make sure that both oscillators are turned on and that the wave shape is set to a saw wave. So now it sounds like this. Next thing we're going to do is make sure that this oscillator is assigned to filter 2, so we have control over both of them, and also to amplifier 2. So now you're gonna get a much louder sound. And this is because we have 2 amplifiers now. Next thing is we're gonna make sure one of the oscillators are 1 octave up. You can detune this one slightly. And we're going to pan this one slightly to the right and this one slightly to the left. The cool thing about analog is that you can tweak each oscillator separately for the filtering. So for example, here I have the higher octave very filtered, but the second one it's wide open. Ideally you want to manage both at the same time, but that's a cool thing to keep into consideration if you are looking for some of those features. Now with the EQing, we're going to see how much of the frequencies we want to take out. we want to make sure that the voices are set to mono. And then for the amplifiers, let's make sure that the ADSR controls are set like this. Now, if we turn on the glide, we can increase this time. The more you pan these ones and the more you detune this, the more width you're going to get. Now we're going to make sure that everything below 150 Hertz is mono, and that's what our Reese Bass sounds like. So now we're gonna move into the wavetable synth. This is what it looks like by default, and it sounds like this. By default, it's set to a sine wave. So we're going to bring it here, which is a saw. Now you can hear how different it sounds already. And we're gonna make sure to turn on the second oscillator and do the same thing. Now we want to make sure that the amp ADSR settings are on point. As I mentioned before, we have a long release. I already let go of the note, but it's still playing. There's a very long tail, but if I have it short, as soon as I let go of the key, it stops. Here we can set our frequency filtering. But first, we want to make sure that one of the oscillators is 1 octave higher. So that's going to be 12 semitones. The cool thing about wavetable is that you can have very interesting sounds as you move between the fundamental shapes, which are the square, sawtooth, triangle, and sine wave. You can have a saw wave with a bit of a triangle sound or a bit of a square sound. So that's an interesting thing to keep in mind. Next thing we want to make sure is that we turn this poly into mono, and we can dial in how much glide we want. Around 300 milliseconds, 200 is a good spot. So now for the oscillator 2, we're going to add some detuning. And then to make sure that it's wide, we're going to change the unison into classic. Here you can dial in how many voices you want and how much of it. I recommend staying to around maximum 5 voices. And now we're going to shape the sound with our EQing. And we're going to make sure that everything below 150 Hertz is mono with our utility. If I had to recommend any of these synths, I would recommend Serum and Wavetable for making the Reese Bass, but I still wanted to show you guys how to make it with all of them, just in case you find yourself needing to use one specific one. So that's going to be it for today's video. I hope you found it helpful and I hope you learned something new. If you did, make sure to leave a comment, like, and consider subscribing, and I will see you in the next one.